At 4 in the morning, the town belonged to no one. The traffic light at Main and Cedar blinked yellow over an empty crossing. Frost lay along the hoods of the parked trucks. The bakery ovens had not been lit, and in the houses on Elm Street, people slept the good sleep of people who are expected somewhere in the morning. One man was already awake. His name was Daniel Brooks. He was 72 years old. He had lived in this town for most of his life, and for the last 6 years, he had slept beneath a covered bridge on River Road, in a hollow of dry stone where the wind came off the water, but the rain never reached him. He did not think of himself as a man without a home. He thought of himself as a man with a good deal of work to do before breakfast. He woke without an alarm. He had not needed one since he was 19. The first thing he did each morning was fold his blanket into thirds and roll it tight enough that it would shed water if it had to. Then he set his boots side by side and brushed the river silt from the leather until it took the light again. His backpack stood upright against the stone, packed the same way every day so that his hands could find anything in the dark. Order was not a small thing to Daniel. Order was the difference between a man who was living somewhere and a man who was only stopping. He washed at the spigot behind Cedar Street Church, where the water ran cold enough to hurt. He shaved with a straight razor and a hand mirror the size of a playing card. He combed his silver hair back, trimmed his gray beard close, and buttoned his flannel shirt to the collar. Then he put on the olive-green field jacket, faded almost to the color of dry grass, and stood a moment in the dark, ready. The church steps came first. Nobody had asked him to sweep them. He had started 6 years ago, on a morning when he could not sleep and the leaves had drifted 3 deep against the doors, and he had never stopped. He swept the treads, then the landing, then the walk down to the sidewalk, and when he was finished, the stone looked cared for, which was the entire point. After that, he walked the length of the tracks behind Depot Street with an empty feed sack, picking up whatever the wind had carried there. Cans, paper, a child's mitten once, which he tied to the fence post at the crossing where the child's mother would find it. By 6, he was at the back door of Dunbar Hardware, waiting for the delivery truck. He unloaded it twice a week. Dunbar paid him in cash, and once tried to pay him more than the work was worth. Daniel counted out the difference and put it back on the counter. "That's not what we agreed on," he said. At 7, he allowed himself 1 cup of coffee at the blue door, black, in a paper cup, standing at the end of the counter where he was not in anyone's way. He paid for it. He always paid for it. There were people in Millbrook who had known Daniel Brooks his whole life and did not know one true thing about him. They knew he was clean. They knew he was polite. They knew he never asked anyone for anything, which made a certain kind of person uneasy, because a man who never asks is a man you cannot feel generous about. They did not know about the medal. It rode in the left inside pocket of his field jacket, wrapped in a square of blue cloth, and it had ridden there for 51 years. A bronze star. His name on the back of it, and a date in 1969. And behind that date, a river in another country, and smoke, and the weight of men on his shoulders, and the ones he reached in time, and the ones he did not. He never took it out. He only checked, sometimes, with 2 fingers through the fabric that it was still there. Grace Miller had run the library for 31 years and had been retired for 4, which meant she still came in 3 days a week, and no one had the nerve to stop her. She was the first person in town to treat Daniel like a neighbor instead of a situation. She did not offer him money. She asked him to carry boxes. She asked him to look at the hinge on the reading room door, which had squealed since the Carter administration, And when he fixed it, she made a note of the hours and paid him from the Friends of the Library Fund, with a receipt. On Thursdays, she brought soup in a lidded jar and set it on the bench beside him without ceremony. "I made too much," she said, every single Thursday for 2 years. Her husband had been dead 9 years. Daniel understood the arithmetic of a pot of soup made for one. He never said so. He simply ate it while it was hot, because that was the courtesy, and he always returned the jar washed. The days were full, the evenings were not. That is the part people rarely understand about a life like Daniel's. It was not the cold that wore on him. The cold was a problem, and problems have solutions. It was the hour after the town's kitchen lights came on, when the smell of other people's suppers moved down the streets, and the windows filled with the ordinary miracle of somebody talking to somebody else. He would sit under the bridge with his small lantern and listen to the river work at the stones. He had a sister in Ohio who had passed in 1998. He had friends whose names were cut into granite in the park by the flagpole. He had 100 acquaintances and no one at all who would notice on any given morning whether he had gotten up. He was not bitter about it. Bitterness is a kind of clutter, and he kept his life swept. But he was lonely. A man can be upright and useful and still be lonely.
The rain came in on the second Tuesday of October and stayed for 3 days. Daniel heard it before he saw it. He had come to sweep at 5 in the dark, and beneath the church steps in the crawl space where the stone landing met the foundation, something was breathing fast and shallow. He set the lantern down on the walk. He did not shine it in. A golden Labrador, 4 years old or thereabouts, soaked black at the chest and shoulders, pressed as far back into the stone as an animal could press. No collar. Ribs showing under the wet coat. One ear torn, old and healed. The dog's eyes came up and found him, and Daniel knew that look. He had seen it on men. He had worn it himself in a field hospital in 1969, when a nurse reached for his arm and he flinched hard enough to tear the stitches. It is the look of a creature that has learned that hands mean something bad. Daniel did not reach out. He sat down on the wet stone 6 feet away, with his back to the wind, and waited. He did not speak much that first morning. He said, "All right," a few times, in the voice you use for horses and frightened people, and he tore his sandwich in half and set the half on the stone at the outer edge of his reach, and then he looked away, because being looked at is a pressure. The dog did not come out. He swept the steps around it, quietly, and went to work. He came back at noon. The half sandwich was gone, and the dog was still there. He came back that night with a strip of cardboard, which he wedged along the open side of the crawl space to break the wind, and a folded burlap sack from the hardware store, which he pushed in slowly with the end of the broom handle and left. On the third morning, the dog was lying on the burlap. On the fifth morning, it came out to the bottom step while Daniel was working and lay down there with its chin on its paws and watched him sweep. He did not touch it. He had learned in a long life that trust is a thing you are given and never a thing you take. The following week, the dog followed him. 10 paces back at first, stopping when he stopped, sitting when he sat, closing to 8 paces, then 5. Down Cedar and along Main and out to the tracks and back all morning at the exact distance of an animal deciding. On a Thursday, at the corner by the blue door, Daniel felt something press against the side of his knee and stay there. He looked down. The dog looked up. He crouched, slow, and put his hand out flat, and the dog put its head under it and Daniel Brooks knelt on a cold sidewalk with his hand on a strange dog's skull and found he could not immediately stand up again. "Well," he said when he could. "Hello?" The name came that afternoon, and it was not clever. He tried a few, none of them fit. And then he said, "Come on, buddy," at the crossing, and the dog swung around at once, ears up, as though the matter had been settled some time ago, and he was glad Daniel had finally caught up. Buddy, then. 3 days after that, a 20-pound bag of dog food was sitting on the church landing when Daniel came to sweep. Beside it, 2 wool blankets, folded square, still smelling of the dryer. No note. Nobody watching from a window. He looked up and down Cedar Street and saw only the streetlight and the mist. It happened again the next week, and the week after. Always before dawn, always without a name attached. And it took Daniel a month to work it out, and he only worked it out because of the hours. Emily Rodriguez was 34 years old and worked nights in the emergency room at the county hospital, 11 to 7, which put her car on Cedar Street at 7:10 in the morning, going home. She had noticed the dog. She had noticed the man who fed the dog before he ate. She never once stopped the car to be thanked. Years later, when someone finally asked her why, she said, "Because he wasn't a project. He was a person having a hard winter. You don't make somebody perform gratitude for a bag of dog food." Reverend Michael Hayes had watched Daniel sweep those steps for 6 years from the study window, and had spent 5 of them trying to find a way to help that Daniel would accept. He had offered the church basement. Daniel had thanked him and declined. He had offered a bed at the county shelter, 40 minutes south. Daniel had thanked him and declined, and added kindly that they didn't take dogs, and that he was not going to be the sort of man who improved his own circumstances by leaving one. So the Reverend changed tactics. He started bringing 2 mugs of coffee out at 6 in the morning, and sitting down on the cold steps to drink his. And after a while, they were simply 2 men on a step, and the dog lay between them with his chin across Daniel's boot. "You could take the caretaker's cottage," Hayes said once, nodding across the lot at the little stone building sagging under its own roof. "It's been empty 11 years. "It's been empty 11 years for a reason," Daniel said. "Some of them are fixable." Daniel drank his coffee and said nothing, and the Reverend let it sit. The first hard freeze came in early November. Daniel banked the wind side of the hollow with cardboard and stone, laid 1 blanket under and 1 over, and Buddy stretched out along his spine like something built to fit there. The talking started around then. Small things at first, weather and route, and whether the ice at the crossing looked worth going around. Then, later in the dark, other things. Names. A river in 1969. A boy from Toledo who had been 19 the same week Daniel was. Buddy never needed him to finish a sentence, which is a rare and underrated quality. Daniel took him to the clinic on Route 9 with $40 of hardware money, and the vet scanned him twice and found no chip, checked the county listings and found no report, and said, "Somebody moved and left him, most likely. Happens more than you'd think." Then she said the thing that would matter later. "Legally, he's a stray. If animal control picks him up, you'd have to claim him properly. That means an address." Daniel put the $40 on the counter and did not answer. Something in Millbrook shifted that autumn. And it shifted the way real things do, which is slowly and in small pieces. It started with the children. Buddy waited outside the blue door every morning while Daniel bought his coffee, and children on their way to school stopped to put their hands in his fur, and Buddy sat for all of them with enormous patience, thumping his tail against the brick. Parents who had never spoken to Daniel Brooks began saying good morning, because it is difficult to ignore a man whose dog your daughter greets by name. Dunbar started putting him on the schedule 3 days instead of 2. Grace found him more hinges. The woman who ran the blue door began setting his coffee on the counter before he asked, and charging him for it, because she had learned quickly that a free cup would end the arrangement. Nobody in town made a decision about Daniel. Nobody held a meeting. They simply came to know him, and knowing a man is the beginning of every other decent thing. Old Walter Pruitt, 81 years old, 40 years on the railroad and 11 months a widower, took to walking down from Depot Street just to say hello to the dog. On the 20th of December, a delivery truck backfired at the corner of Main and Cedar. Daniel felt his own body go rigid, the old reflex, 51 years old and still faster than thought. And when he turned, Buddy was already 40 yards down the street and running flat out, ears back, in the blind and total panic of an animal remembering something Daniel would never know the shape of. He called once. He knew better than to chase. Then he walked. He walked the tracks to the grain elevator and back. He walked River Road out past the bridge and the flats. He walked until 9 that night and started again at 4 the next morning, checking every crawl space and culvert and stand of brush in Millbrook. He asked at the blue door. He asked at the hardware store. He asked politely, and he described the dog carefully, and when people said no, he thanked them and moved on. He did not sleep more than an hour either night. Grace Miller made a sign at the library and copied 40 of them. Emily Rodriguez drove the county roads on her way home in the gray of the morning, slow, looking at the ditches. The snow came on the second day. It came the way it does once or twice in a decade, in a wall out of the northwest, and by 3 in the afternoon the county had pulled the plows off the back roads and the radio had gone to the tone that means stay where you are. Daniel swept the church steps anyway. It took 20 minutes and they were white again in 5. Reverend Hayes came out with the storm door banging behind him and said, "Daniel, inside. Tonight I'm not asking." "Give me an hour," Daniel said. He walked River Road one more time with his lantern, calling into the wind. And the wind took the sound and folded it away, and the light reached maybe 15 feet, and after an hour he turned back because he was 72 and not a fool. He was on the church landing, stamping the snow off his boots when he heard it. Barking. Frantic, ragged, close. Buddy came out of the white at the bottom of the steps, with ice matted along his belly and his coat frozen into ridges. And he did not run to Daniel. He stopped 10 feet short, barked twice, and turned back toward the tracks. Daniel came down the steps fast. Buddy let him get close enough to touch, took the sleeve of the field jacket in his teeth, pulled, released, and moved off again into the storm, looking back. Daniel had spent a year of his life reading the behavior of frightened creatures under pressure, and he did not spend 1 second wondering. He shouted up at the church door for Hayes to call the county and send them to the crossing behind Depot Street. Then he pulled his collar up and followed the dog. 400 yards. It took 9 minutes. The snow was mid-shin in the open and thigh-deep against the embankment, and the wind came straight down the rail line like it was being poured. Buddy stopped at the bottom of the embankment where the drift had built along the ties and stood over a shape in the snow and howled. Walter Pruitt had gone out at noon to check on the neighbor's furnace and had taken the shortcut he had taken for 60 years, and his hip had gone out from under him on the ballast stone. And he had been in the snow for perhaps 3 hours. He was grey. He was not shivering, and Daniel knew exactly what that meant. He knelt and got 2 fingers to the old man's throat and found something, thin and slow. He did not try to carry him. He was 72, and the ground was ice, and a fall would have killed them both. He took off his field jacket and spread it over Walter's chest and belly, tucked it under. He pulled off his flannel shirt in the wind and wrapped it around the bare head. He got his own body between the old man and the northwest wind and pressed his palms flat against the sides of Walter's face. "Buddy, here." The dog understood, or did what he wanted to do anyway, and lay full length along Walter's other side and did not move again. "Walter Pruitt," Daniel said close to his ear. "This is Dan Brooks. You're not staying out here. Stay with me." He said it for 11 minutes, until he saw the yellow lights of the plow. At 11 that night, in the emergency room at the county hospital, Emily Rodriguez took a soaked field jacket off a gurney rail to hang it where it would dry. It was heavier on one side than it should have been. She reached into the inside pocket, thinking of a wallet or a set of keys, and came out with a small square of blue cloth, worn soft as a handkerchief, and the weight inside it turned over into her palm. A bronze star on a red ribbon, tarnished dark in the crevices. On the back, engraved small and shallow with 50 years of pocket wear. D. Brooks. Emily Rodriguez stood in a bright hallway holding it. Her grandfather had one in a drawer in Corpus Christi and had shown it to her exactly once, and had never in his life said a word about how he got it. Down the corridor, wrapped in a hospital blanket with his boots off and a wet dog leaning against his shins, sat a man who had walked into a whiteout without a coat because a Labrador pulled his sleeve. She wrapped the medal back in its cloth and put it where she found it. Walter Pruitt came back, slowly and completely. Core temperature of 89 degrees on arrival, a fractured hip, and a doctor who told his daughter, in the plain way they sometimes do, that another 40 minutes would have settled the question. Reverend Michael Hayes sat in the waiting room until 6 in the morning, and then went and found Daniel asleep, sitting upright in a plastic chair, with his hand resting on the dog's back. The Reverend had known Daniel Brooks for 6 years, and had believed, in an unexamined way, that he understood him. Sweeps the steps, doesn't drink, won't take help. A good man in reduced circumstances. He had never once wondered what the man had been at 19. When Daniel woke, Hayes said only, "Walter's going to be fine. His daughter's driving up from Columbus." Daniel nodded and rubbed his face with both hands and said, "That dog found him. I want that in whatever gets said. The dog found him." "I'll say it." "Say it first," Daniel said. The story got out the way things get out in a town of 4,000, which is instantly and inaccurately, and then slowly and correctly. Daniel asked the newspaper not to run the medal. He sat in the reading room with Grace Miller and said he did not want it printed, because a citation is a piece of paper about one afternoon, and there were men from that afternoon who had no piece of paper and no afternoons since, and it was not his to trade on. Grace listened all the way through, which was her particular gift. Then she said, "Daniel, you can decide what you say. You don't get to decide what this town feels about you. That part isn't yours. He turned his coffee cup around twice on the table. They'll want to fix me, he said. Some of them will. That'll pass in a month. She closed the paper. The ones who are left will want to work with you. That's different. And you know the difference, and you're going to have to let them. The article ran on page 3, 6 paragraphs. It led with the dog. 2 weeks later, Reverend Hayes walked Daniel across the church lot in the January cold and stood him in front of the caretaker's cottage. Here's what I've got, he said. 1 room, a loft, a wood stove that hasn't been lit since Bush was president. The roof's gone soft on the north side, and there's a raccoon situation. The parish can't afford to hire this out, and the diocese has been after us to condemn it. Daniel walked the perimeter. He pulled a piece of trim loose with 2 fingers and looked at the wood behind it, and smelled it, and put it back. Sills are sound, he said. That's what I hoped you'd say. Hayes put his hands in his coat pockets. This is a job, Daniel. The parish needs a caretaker. Snow, boiler, grounds, the 100 things I can't get to. The cottage comes with it, the way it always did. Daniel stood a long time in the snow, looking at a broken building. I'll do the repairs myself, he said. I'll pay rent out of the hardware hours. My name goes on the agreement, and I sign it same as anybody. Same as anybody, Hayes said. They came on a Saturday, and Daniel did not ask them to. Dunbar sent shingles at cost and then showed up to carry them. 2 men of the county road crew, who had gone to school with Daniel's late sister, framed out the north wall. Emily Rodriguez came straight off a night shift in her scrubs and spent 4 hours scraping paint before anybody told her to go home and sleep. Walter Pruitt's daughter drove up from Columbus with a wood stove out of her father's basement, and Walter came with her, on a walker, and supervised from a folding chair with a blanket on his knees for 6 weeks running, which he considered essential. Nobody called it charity, because it was not shaped like charity. It was shaped like a barn raising. Daniel was on the ladder. Daniel called the cuts. When a man tried to slip him money in the doorway, Daniel folded it back into the man's coat pocket and handed him a scraper instead. Grace Miller brought soup for 11 people and told everyone she had made too much. By the first week of March, there was a light on in the caretaker's cottage after dark. The last piece of paperwork was the one that mattered most. Buddy had been astray for 4 months in the county's eyes, and a stray belongs to nobody, and a man with no address cannot make a claim. Daniel had understood that since the clinic on Route 9 and had carried it quietly all winter, the way he carried everything. Emily drove him out to the shelter on a Tuesday in March. The clerk asked for a name, an address, a phone number for the parish office. She asked about a fenced yard, and Daniel said no, but 4 miles a day on foot, every day, which she wrote down and underlined. Then she turned the clipboard around. Daniel Brooks signed his name slowly, the way people do when a signature is not a formality. He's yours, the clerk said. Congratulations. Outside in the parking lot, Daniel stood with his hand on the roof of the car for a moment longer than he needed to. Buddy leaned against his knee. Emily looked politely at the middle distance until he was ready. All right, Daniel said. Let's go home. He had not used the word in 6 years. Behind the cottage stood the old carriage barn, 60 feet of dry timber full of ruined hymnals, and a lawn tractor from 1974. Daniel cleared it out in 9 days. He had no plan for it. He simply could not leave a good building doing nothing. He built 2 benches from the church's scrap pile and hung a pegboard and cleaned 40 years of rust off a set of tools that had belonged to some caretaker before him. The first child came in April, a 10-year-old from Elm Street with a bicycle chain in a plastic bag, because his mother had said that the man behind the church could probably fix it. Daniel did not fix it. He put the boy on a stool and showed him where the master link was, and let him ruin it twice and get it right the third time. The boy came back the next Saturday with a friend. By June there were 9 of them, and Reverend Hayes ran an extension of the church's insurance over it, and a girl named for her grandmother painted a board and nailed it above the doors. It said, "Buddy's Workshop," because the children had voted and Daniel had lost. Saturdays ran from 9 to noon, and the rules were short. You put a tool back where it lives. You do not use a tool you have not been taught. You finish what you start, or you say out loud that you are stopping. They fixed bicycles mostly. Chains, brakes, a wheel true enough to ride. In the fall they built birdhouses, and in the spring they built the boxes the town used for the flowers along Main Street. A boy named Marcus rebuilt a push mower over 11 weeks and pushed it home in the rain, refusing all offers of a ride. Grace Miller came Saturdays at 11 with library books and sat in the corner with her back against the doorframe. And one at a time, the children read out loud to Buddy, who was a patient and undemanding audience and who never once corrected anyone's pronunciation. There were kids in that barn who did not read out loud anywhere else in their lives. Daniel kept the wood stove going and moved from bench to bench with his hands behind his back, and asked questions instead of giving answers, which took twice as long and worked 10 times better. A boy dropped a warped wheel on the bench one Saturday and said it was junk. Daniel picked it up and turned it slowly in front of the window and did not answer for a while, which the children had learned meant something was coming. "Maybe," he said, "but you decided that in about 4 seconds. Give it an honest look first." He set it in the truing stand and had the boy find the high spot with a piece of chalk, and they spent 40 minutes on it, a quarter turn at a time, and it did not come out perfect. It came out rideable. "Rule of the shop," Daniel said. "Everything gets one honest look before we call it finished with." "Even a wheel?" "Especially a wheel," Daniel said. "It's easy with a wheel. Get good at it here." He set it down. "Because it's the same skill you'll need later when it's a dog somebody left behind. Or a person. Every life is worth protecting, and most of the time, protecting it just means somebody was willing to look twice." The boy rode that wheel for 2 years. The medal came out exactly once. A 9-year-old named Theo, who had heard a version of the story from a cousin, asked straight out, the way 9-year-olds do, whether Daniel had a medal and where he kept it. Grace looked up from her book. The barn got quiet. Daniel wiped his hands, sat down on the stool, and took the blue cloth out of his jacket pocket. He unfolded it in his palm. "Is it gold?" "Bronze." "What did you do?" Daniel looked at it a while. "I was 22, he said. There was a river. A boat took a hit. I could swim and most of them couldn't, and I went back 4 times and I got some of them out." "All of them?" "No," Daniel said. "Not all of them." Theo thought about that. "Why do you keep it in your pocket instead of in a frame?" "Because a medal isn't a story you tell," Daniel said. "It's a weight you carry. Mine reminds me of men who don't get to carry theirs." He folded the cloth and put it away. "Now go sweep under your bench." On the last Monday in May, Daniel walked down to the park by the flagpole, the way he had walked down every year for 30 years, alone. That year he was not alone. 11 children from the workshop came, and Grace, and Reverend Hayes, and Walter Pruitt on a cane by then, and Emily Rodriguez, who had come off shift at 7 and stayed up for it. The memorial is a slab of grey granite with 41 names on it, and a flagpole behind it. And it is not a grand thing. Daniel took off his cap. He put his hand flat on the top edge of the stone and read 4 names out loud, slowly, and did not explain who they were, and no one asked. Then he told the children the only piece of it he ever told them. These were boys, he said, 19, 20. They liked baseball, and they wrote letters home, and one of them could not sing at all and sang constantly. He put his cap back on. They were worth protecting. So is everybody standing here. That's the whole lesson, and you can go play now. The spring came in green and stayed. The cottage had a porch by then, built by 4 teenagers and inspected twice by Walter. There were tulips along the walk that Grace had put in without asking, and a rain barrel, and a mat by the door, and a mailbox at the end of the church lot with Brooks on the side in white letters. Daniel still woke at 4. He still swept the church steps in the dark before the sun came over the water tower. He still bought his own coffee at the Blue Door and paid for it. What changed was smaller and larger than any of it. He was expected somewhere now. If the steps were not swept by 6, Reverend Hayes came looking. If he missed a Thursday, Grace called the parish office. If Buddy was not at the Blue Door at 7, 3 children wanted to know why. He was still the same man. He had always been the same man. The town had simply learned to see him, and being seen, for a person who has gone a long time without it, is a kind of medicine that works slowly and all the way down. He never talked much about the years under the bridge. When people brought it up, he would say it had been cold in February, and leave it there. But sometimes, on a summer night, he would sit on the porch with his hand on the dog's head and think about the October morning he heard something breathing under the church steps, and about a frightened animal that had every reason to stay in the dark and came out anyway. Neither of them had rescued the other. That is not how it works, and Daniel would have been the first to say so. A dog cannot give a man his life back, and a man cannot give a dog a childhood. What they did was simpler. They gave each other a reason to be somewhere at a particular hour. They made each other findable. The medal had reminded Daniel of who he once was, but Buddy reminded him who he still was. Sometimes the greatest heroes are simply the people who never stop choosing kindness. Until we meet again, thank you for keeping kindness alive.